There's no way Brandon Ingram could be traded to the Sacramento Kings, right? Right? I'll actually tell you why it makes more sense than you think. Plus, the latest free agent updates and rumors, and we say goodbye to both Naji Marshall and Jonas Valanciunas. It's a Monday episode of Locked On Pelicans, a start of free agency episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Monday, the start of free agency. Pelicans being a little bit quiet, but there's no need to panic. We'll get into the latest news and rumors in the second part of today's episode. But I want to start with Brandon Ingram. We heard reports that maybe the Sacramento Kings are looking at him. On the surface, doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Nothing New Orleans would want. But when you really think about it, a trade there actually can start to come together pretty quickly. We'll explain why in today's episode. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. We just broke down in an emergency episode coming to you as soon as possible about the Dejounte Murray trade for the Pelicans. Go give that a listen if you haven't already. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So let's get into this one. I saw a couple reports out there, and this has been said for a while. You know, the Sacramento Kings, per FanDuel, are one of the early teams to be a favorite for trading for Brandon Ingram. And then we saw reports that the Sacramento Kings are aggressively trying to get Brandon Ingram. It's not something the Pelicans should entertain, right? They should just kind of hang up the phone pretty quickly. It seems like, you know, if you're not going to get De'Aaron Fox, and they're not, and you don't really necessarily need him as much with Dejounte Murray here on the team, a trade doesn't make a ton of sense all of a sudden. You know, you're not going to get some bonus from them. But actually thinking more about this, I see the logic behind why the Pelicans would actually entertain this. And there's two big reasons for it. So on the surface, again, this doesn't make sense. You know, the trade would be, if it's just a straight up two-team trade, Harrison Barnes, Kevin Huerter, and like 2-3 first-round picks, probably 3 first-round picks would be needed. I don't think the Sacramento Kings are going to give up Keegan Murray in this deal. So Harrison Barnes, Kevin Huerter, and 3 future first-round picks. For Brandon Ingram, that seems like a bad trade, right? But hold on, let me explain. You know, go back to the Atlanta Hawks deal for Dejounte Murray. That's a team that wants to be competitive, you know, in theory now around Trae Young. They don't need first round picks, but they just picked up, you know, essentially 3 if you count Dyson Daniels from the Pelicans. And the idea is then use those picks for something else. It's hard to figure out trades in the NBA. So the Pelicans are in the same boat. They don't need picks from the Kings, especially when you trade them a player that's going to make them better. But here's the thing. Having mid-level salary is useful. So look at the contracts, not so much the players, of Harrison Barnes and Kevin Huerter. Harrison Barnes makes $18 million next year. Kevin Huerter is $16.8. The Pelicans, with a very top-heavy roster, particularly after the Brandon Ingram trade, and more on the salary cap in the next segment a little bit here, you know, don't really have that kind of mid-tier tradable salary, something in the 20s range. That's not what they have at all right now. It's basically, you know, high-end guys, 4 of them on the team, and then low-level salary dudes. There's nothing in the middle. So you kind of need that mid-tier salary to try and make some of these trades work. And it means that you're not so much as trading for Harrison Barnes as you're so much as trading for an $18 million contract that you will then flip later and include these first-round picks involved with this deal to try and get something better. Essentially what this would do, while being an unexciting trade and probably something we would look at and be like, that's all for Brandon Ingram, is it would give the Pelicans far more flexibility than they have right now. A significant amount of flexibility that they don't really have right now. It's a bit of a like super galaxy brain move, thinking chess, not checkers. And I don't love those sorts of things because say you can't trade Harrison Barnes, you're stuck with him for 2 years. Say you can't trade Kevin Huerter, and I think Huerter and Barnes could be they would be contributors on this team. But what if you can't move them? You're stuck with them. It's a bit of a gamble there, and this is one of those things that I don't particularly love. Sometimes you get things in deals and there's uses for them, but it doesn't end up working out. Right? This is, I think, in that area. And one of the things I'm going to say here, and I want to make this very clear, I'm not taking a shot at anyone because Shamit Dua and his In the Know Substack is very good. He loves trade exceptions. And I get the need for having them. I just don't think they get used like we would like to see them used, even though the Pelicans would probably use it in this case. So maybe, in the NBA. So sometimes it's great to create a trade exception, but if you don't use it and it expires a year later, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good, I think. And so I'm kind of a little bit more practical about trading for guys that are going to make this team better tomorrow for the start of the regular season. But it's worth noting that, after the draft, after the draft, before they introduced the new players, you had David Griffin talking about how your roster isn't set in July. It's not even set on training camp, right? It could be set during the regular season at the trade deadline. That's kind of hinting at more moves to come that might not happen immediately. So, that's why we said be patient with a move that New Orleans would make. And then, next day or two, they made the Dejounte Murray trade. They then might be telegraphing to y'all and us, me too, that there's going to be moves made during the regular season. So there could be a Brandon Ingram trade that maybe brings back a weaker return than we would like to see, but they're going to turn that into something much later, maybe in February at the trade deadline. And that's when your final roster, takes shape. And it matters at the end of the season, not the start of the regular season. And that's something that's worth keeping in mind. The other way a trade, I said there were two, to the Sacramento Kings would make sense is a 3-team deal, right? Like you could expand this. This could get bigger. And you might even see that with the Dejounte Murray trade. It's not finalized yet. And so until these things are finalized, you often can see them expand a little bit. And you've seen, and we've talked about it here, David Griffin does that, can address multiple needs in one deal by expanding that trade and getting very creative within the rules of what you're allowed to do. You can get a 3-team trade. We'll talk about Wendell Carter Jr. in the next segment here as we get into the rumors of the trade market and free agency for the Pelicans. But you could have a deal that includes Orlando with a starting center coming back to New Orleans along with some mid-tier salary. And then that makes you better now, gets you your starting center, and then allows you to be aggressive at the trade market at the trade deadline and see what else you can do to get your team where you want it to be. So nothing needs to be set right now. And it's one of those things where, say a Brandon Ingram trade happens, tomorrow. I'm not hinting that it is here, that it might not look great, but that's not going to be the end of all of this. And I think that's something that's worth keeping in mind. So yeah, on the surface, Sacramento, no. And then you think about it a little bit more and you go, okay, yeah, I see this. Chess, not checkers. And maybe that's kind of the way that the Pelicans front office is thinking. So coming up next, it's a quiet start to free agency, kind of in general, I thought, but also really for the New Orleans Pelicans minus losing 2 guys. But let's look at where they stand with some of the free agent targets that we've talked about here on Locked On Pelicans and some of the trade targets that I think could make sense for the Pelicans as well. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports, and I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But as the NBA playoffs are now over, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets me and you keep the sports going whenever you want. And all you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that you're in the mood. And it's great to do it this summer. FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. There might not be the NBA, but you've got Major League Baseball. You've got soccer. The Olympics are coming up too. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the official sports betting partner of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen today, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? You watching something else where they're not talking sports? Do you have to turn down the volume with all that yelling? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's get into free agency. There's a couple of players that are off the board. And, don't panic. New Orleans is in a weird spot where the Brandon Ingram deal, we don't know what it's going to be, and we're expecting a trade. The Dejounte Murray trade is not finalized yet, too. All of that impacts what the Pels can do in free agency. And one thing that's worth noting, and I got to update my cap sheet on all of this, is that the luxury tax line, and that means the first and second apron and overall salary cap, came in lower by about $1.4 million or so. That is more impactful than you might think. 1.4, when you're talking $170 million, doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is and can impact how the Pelicans are able to spend and what they can do in free agency. And there's a couple of roster spots that they still need to figure out and resolve here. So as we said in the Dejounte Murray trade reaction episode, didn't expect them to be active in the first day of free agency because so many things are kind of in the air and uncertain that you can't sign someone to a big contract and then, it limits what you could trade Brandon Ingram for because you are hard capped at the first apron, which is where the Pelicans are. And by the way, we explained that too, and why that wasn't a thing to panic about in the bonus show and in the show before that we talked about here. This is why you should subscribe to Locked On Pelicans. So it's a quiet start to free agency for New Orleans. Just nothing happening here. And you saw some moves get immediately done. And I'm not panicking that these were guys that maybe we wanted in New Orleans and now they're no longer going to be, and it's okay. Starting with Chris Paul getting waived by the Golden State Warriors. Their era is ending hard here. Signing with the San Antonio Spurs, a move that I secretly really like. You also saw Mason Plumlee go off the board, and then Andre Drummond immediately after that signed with the Philadelphia 76ers. So all of a sudden, the Pelicans, who are in drastic need of front court depth, but they need some centers, right? You can't roll in with Yves Missi yet. And we'll talk more about him later in the week because I'm starting to come around on that pick more than I was when it was initially made. Talking to people around him and people with the team a little bit more, and I'll share all of that with you later in the week here. There's still plenty of options. You can look at someone like Thomas Bryant on a veteran minimum deal would make some sense if you just need a starter to soak up some minutes. I think one of the things they want to probably try and do is get a starting center and then sign another center. So maybe one in a trade. We'll hit on some trade targets here in a second. And, maybe sign one in free agency. Thomas Bryant on a veteran minimum deal in free agency makes an absolute ton of sense for New Orleans. You just need someone to soak up 20 minutes per game. That's kind of what you're looking for. It doesn't need to be, a guy that is going to make a massive impact. You need someone there as things are now to do that. And you can still conceivably trade Brandon Ingram for starting center. Jared Allen might be the name that, is on everyone's mind that seems attainable. Miles Turner is a name that a lot of y'all have mentioned to me since the Dejounte Murray trade. I just don't see him getting traded right now from the Indiana Pacers. I agree that he could be very, very ideal for the New Orleans Pelicans as a three-point shooting big man, but I don't know if that team wants to move him for how key he has been for them. But you have someone like Thomas Bryant, would make sense. He's been limited the past couple of years here and hasn't kind of played the amount of games that maybe we would see. But with Miami last year in 38 games, 6 points per game, 4 rebounds. It's not horrible numbers, including being involved in a fight with Naji Marshall. Pour one out for him on the team last year. But you also have someone like Mo Bamba that you could get for a veteran minimum in free agency. And this is someone who his career has not gone exactly what you would have wanted to have seen. In Philadelphia last year, 57 games. You don't look for the solid numbers there because his role was very reduced, but he can definitely play a little bit. 5 points, 4.4 points per game, 4 rebounds. This is a guy who can still try and block some shots In 13 minutes per game, he averaged a block per. He also shot 39% from three. He's added that three-point shot to his arsenal. It's limited minutes, but if you extrapolate that out to 36 minutes per game last season, 12.3 points per game, 11.6 rebounds, 2 assists. He had almost 3 blocks per game and took over 3 threes. I don't want him playing 36 minutes, but for a veteran minimum to play some minutes for you, that's a guy that I do think maybe makes some sense. You also have some trade targets that I think are out there that could be involved in that Brandon Ingram trade, expanded out to three teams, right? Wendell Carter Jr., I think, is probably the name that's going to make the most sense and the easiest one to acquire. He's on the Orlando Magic and did pretty well for them last season, I thought. He gives you mobility on the perimeter. He can shoot a little bit too. I wouldn't call him an elite shooter, but he's pretty good. 37.4% last season on over 3 attempts per game. 11 points, 7 rebounds, including a bunch on the offensive glass. Those are pretty good numbers to me. Gives you enough kind of rim protection, shot blocking. Not great, but that's what you drafted Yves Missi for. And you're looking at doing this as a platoon. And again, this all might be moot if they end up trading Brandon Ingram and bringing in a big name kind of splashy center. And I think that's ultimately the goal. But beyond a guy like Wendell Carter Jr., you have Walker Kessler, someone that I've seen mentioned a lot and linked to the Pelicans with the Utah Jazz. I'm not as high on him as others are. He was good his rookie year, finishing 3rd in Rookie of the Year, 9 points, 8.4 rebounds, but didn't take that leap forward last season and in a sense kind of regressed a lot. There is mobility. He's young. That's good. He has a lot of shot blocking potential, I think. But there isn't 3-point shooting there. He's a borderline starter at best. Now, you don't need the starting center position to be anything truly elite for New Orleans, given what they could have out there on the court. But, I wouldn't give up a ton for Walker Kessler. Lauri Markkanen, by the way, for the Utah Jazz, does not play center, and we should not think of him as such. Maybe more on him another day, but I don't really see him getting moved. You also could get someone like Isaiah Stewart from Beef Stew, one of my favorite nicknames here in the NBA. With the Detroit Pistons, they also have Jalen Duren too. But Stewart's more likely to be moved here. He's a little bit older. He's been in the league for 4 years. 11 points, 6.6 rebounds last season, about a block per game. He shoots the 3 ball, not well, but he shoots it. 38% on almost 4 attempts per game last season. Those aren't horrible numbers. Kind of regressed a little bit from the year before. But so you've seen some names go off the board for New Orleans in free agency, but I do think there's still plenty of options out there for him, and they're likely going to address the position through a trade. So someone like Andre Drummond signing with the 76ers, whatever. Mason Plumlee might have been my choice for it, but doesn't truly matter here if all of those guys are off the board. And then Chris Paul, I don't think was, really going to be a realistic option for New Orleans anymore after trading for Dejounte Murray, and that would have been a nice reunion, but $11 million, I think, is what he signed for. That seems a little bit too high and not a number that New Orleans really was going to want to broach or anything like that. So that's kind of where it stands. One person who's definitely not going to be their starting center next year is Jonas Valanciunas. He signed for less than we were expecting. No, maybe not. I take that back. This is about what I thought his market would be. 3 years, $30 million, so $10 million per year. New Orleans could have done that, and then you have a starting center, right? That was never going to be a realistic option, and I will explain why. And let's wish him well and Naji Marshall well. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. We are the #1 Pelicans podcast. So tell your friends. We did an immediate, as soon as I could, getting off the plane, doing a show on Dejounte Murray, kind of breaking it all down for y'all, the kind of biggest takeaways from that, what he needs to improve, right? There's a little bit of risk here for New Orleans with that trade too. As much as I think it is a good deal, I wouldn't be it's an A+++. It's like an A- in my opinion. There's still a little bit of concern. Good deal, but a couple of questions that we still have, and I think that's important to look at and address. make sure you give that show a listen here on Locked On Pelicans. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Tell a friend about the show too. And join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Your second listen today, Locked On Saints, Ross Jackson. Look, Saints season is like just around the corner. Training camp's in like a couple of weeks here. He's going to be out there in Irvine covering training camp on a daily basis. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Saints podcast. Make them your second listen today. So Pelicans lost a couple of people in free agency, and none of this was unexpected. I saw a lot of people wondering if New Orleans could, bring one or both of these guys back, and I just think it was never really going to be the case. And part of it is they're a little bit limited on flexibility right now. Maybe they could have so Naji Marshall signed for 3 years, $27 million with the Dallas Mavericks. He was probably one of the better wings available in unrestricted free agency. That's a pretty good move for them. They're going to make a serious run at Klay Thompson, it sounds like, though. My bet would be he ends up joining the Lakers. But the Dallas Mavericks signing him, what I kind of said was he's going to take the money, and he should. This is someone who in his career just had not made a lot of money, being a two-way, an undrafted guy who then was on a two-way, then got an actual NBA deal. But man, he was dramatically underpaid. For his career in the NBA, he has made so far $3,420,000. Like for 3 years in the league, that is not a lot of money. Now, New Orleans did a very good job kind of discovering him, bringing him along on a two-way, and then earning him some money. Oh, it's 3.4 plus $2 million this year. So he's made like under $5.5 million in 4 years. That's what it is. Which, look, I'll take $5 million in under 4 years, but still, that's not good money by NBA standards. He was going to take kind of the biggest bag, I think. And if he could get a guaranteed $27 million, like good for that dude. I liked having Naji on the team. He was a lot of fun, but one of the things I think we can look at was he's a pretty unskilled player. I was describing him to our Locked On Mavericks host as, if you're looking at it on like the D&D chart of alignments, he's like chaotic good in like the best way possible. The chaotic part being kind of unskilled. He will hustle. He will do all the right things. He will fight for you, back up your guys. But an unskilled player at times, which isn't like a knock on him. It was just, I think New Orleans could use a little bit more like talent structure, though I do think some of the chaos he brought on the court was an important thing. But he was going to go and just take the biggest bag as he should have. $9 million, in theory, New Orleans could bring him back, but they wouldn't have been able to bring him back for a while till the stuff with Brandon Ingram is settled, till the trade with Dejounte Murray is settled. So while it sucks to lose him, I don't think it's ultimately the end of the world. This opens up minutes for Jordan Hawkins, potentially Matt Ryan, though I don't think so. More likely Hawkins is going to really be, heavily entrenched in the rotation next season after this move. So good for him for getting that money. I think New Orleans needs more shooting, a little bit more something else. We're going to miss him, that type of hustle, that type of energy coming in off the bench and just giving New Orleans a spike of adrenaline, I think is something that is very underrated and very needed for a pretty lethargic group at times. But given that this roster is going through some shakeups right now, maybe that concern will be alleviated. The other loss is Jonas Valanciunas leaving to sign with the Washington Wizards for 3 years, $30 million. I like that after drafting Alex Sarr, bringing Valanciunas to maybe mentor him a little bit and kind of give him, another big body to kind of soak up some of what Sarr might struggle with at the early part of his NBA career. For Jonas Valanciunas, like, we just want to say thank you. Like, I mean it. I've long said he's not a bad player. He just didn't fit Willie Green and what the Pelicans wanted to do. The way I have described it is, it's not you, it's me, Jonas. It's not you, it's the Pelicans, Jonas. Like, he's a solid player. Not a guy you want to build a team around, certainly, but a solid player who's just going to be a good soldier, go out and play and never complain. This dude played 82 games last year, 79 the year before, and 74 before that. Basically played as many games as he could possibly play here in New Orleans, and I think that's an important thing and something that we've really got to give him a whole lot of credit for, about as reliable as it comes. Now, wasn't going to be happy here. People are going to see $10 million. They could have brought him back. He could be the starting center. He wasn't going to come back. Like, that dude put his house on the market, I think, like before the end of the regular season, and had like movers out there like the day after the season ended for the New Orleans Pelicans. Even if they offered him more money, I don't think he was going to come back because I don't think he liked his role here. You run the risk of this sometimes. And if New Orleans wanted to bring him back, he was going to say no. Like, he was just done here in this city just because of how he was used. Players want to know that they're going to play. They want to have a role. They want that clearly defined. I think that's important to most of these guys. And Jonas did not have that, next season here. They just didn't use him well. And there was no point in committing $10 million to a player or more, right? That was going to not be used. They've got to be very smart about the remaining funds that they have capped at the first apron. And if you don't know what that is, go listen to the last 2 days of Locked On Pelicans. We cover it here. And so it just made sense that he was going to go. But for both him and Naji, nothing but thank y'all. They did a very good job. Those are two pretty beloved players, I think, here in New Orleans, for the way they played, what they did, and the energy and professionalism that, they brought to this team. And I think that was something that was lacking from, it's obvious it was lacking from a number of the players on this roster. So losing them, it's not the end of the world. Jonas wasn't going to play, so if you lose him, is it that big of a deal? No. Kind of same thing for Naji, right? I think they'll be okay without him here. But those are two guys that did right by the Pelicans. Go and get your money. Go and get your long-term contract if you're Jonas. If you're Naji, get that bag because you deserve it. We're going to miss them, but given the way the Pelicans' salary is structured right now, kind of waiting to figure out a Brandon Ingram deal, waiting to solidify the Dejounte Murray deal, I don't think they could have signed those guys today and then had it not impact other things in the future. And the priorities, these other moves, not either of those two guys. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. We'll have more tomorrow, maybe on Eve Misi, maybe on some other news. We're going to be breaking it down all week long. So please subscribe to the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.